We're glad to have Achim today with us. He's a person that he's working very much aligned with what we're doing here. He's working a lot with computation, but if you start to think what is computation as, let's say, processing information, it not only includes digital processes, but it also includes material processes, something that we are working a lot here at IAAC. We are really testing what we are designing, and we are trying to overlap design processes with material processes. So one of the people that they are working really deep on that issue is Achim Menges. The last year, he's an architect, but he's also a professor in the University of Stuttgart, where he founded the Computational Institute. How is it called? The Institute for Computational Design in Stuttgart. So yeah, thank you very much for being here. I will read a short bio of Achim for the ones that they don't know. He is a registered architect and professor at University of Stuttgart, where he is the founding director of the Institute for Computational Design since 2008. In addition, he has been a visiting professor in architecture at Harvard University from 2009 to 2010, at the IAAC School of Architecture in London, where he graduated from in 2002, and at Rice University in Houston. Achim Menges graduated with honors from the IAAC, where he subsequently taught as Studio Master of the Emerging Technologies and Design Graduate Program, and as Unit Master of the Diploma Unit 4. His practice and research focuses on the development of integral design processes at the intersection of morphogenetic design computation, biomimetic engineer, and computer-aided manufacturing that enables a highly articulated performative built environment. What is interesting about the work of Achim Menges is that he's collaborating a lot with different people and different disciplines, something that we are also believe here very strongly, that architects cannot be any more the solitary artists. He's collaborating with structural engineers, computer scientists, material scientists, and biologists. And apart from his practice, he has also published several books on this work and related fields of design research. And he's the author, co-author of numerous articles and scientific papers. So Achim, thank you for being here with us, and thank you for sharing your day and your time and your conference.
Does that need to be switched on? Does it work? Can you hear me? Oh, fantastic. So it's fantastic to be here tonight because I think we share a lot of common interests, and it's great to show some of our modest attempts to actually contribute to this field of research that you're working on tonight. So what I'm going to do is actually I will first sort of give you a small introduction to the kind of theoretical framework in which we operate, which is very close, I think, to the kind of ambitions and agendas that you work with. And then I will actually try to introduce this kind of, or sort of back these theories with the presentation of 4 research projects, which I will show in detail, which are all projects that have been actually conducted in a very similar context to what you have here. So at the beginning, it's important to realize, as has been mentioned in the introduction, that computation, in its kind of most basic meaning, refers to the processing of information. And this is interesting because in this way, both machinic processes that operate in the binary realm of the digital, as well as kind of material processes that operate in the more complex domain of the physical, can actually be considered to be computation. So while one can argue that there is still a strong bias towards sort of machine computation in contemporary design, sporadic investigations into material computation have also occurred in architecture, not only with you now working on a lot of similar topics, but also historically there are some precedents, and I will introduce them in a second. What has rarely been explored in my eyes is the kind of overlap between machine and material computation, so where these two modes are not simply coexisting, but where they really intensely interact in the design process, which is the focus of our investigations. So at the Institute for Computation Design, we are pursuing sort of the development of an integrative design approach, one in which materialization and design computation are always inherently and absolutely inseparably related. And there's an interesting possible history of such an approach that can be actually traced to some of the most radical and influential academic ventures of the 20th century in Germany, which can also be used to sort of outline the possible spectrum of such an approach. So on the one hand, one could, for example, mention Josef Alber's material studies that he conducted at his focus at the Bauhaus in Dessau, where he really established a precedent for the possible enrichment of design processes through what he actually called material experimentation. And it's very interesting to note that Albers actually rejected established processes of materialization based on professional craft knowledge because he claimed that they stifle invention. Instead, he identified material behavior itself as the creative domain for developing new modes of construction and innovation. And I think that's an aspect that is very often misconceived when looking at the history of the Bauhaus. And his material studies were really understood not as scalar models or representation of ideas, but as temporary unfoldings of material behavior in space and time. On the other hand, Frei Otto's extensive series of experiments at his institute at the University of Stuttgart may serve as a kind of an example of the other end of the spectrum of what we may now call physical computation. And I guess you're all aware that Otto investigated a vast number of different material systems, such as his sort of seminal examples of the soap films and related cable net structures that you can see in these images, that he kind of investigated in order to kind of use the kind of self-forming capacity of matter to be translated into sort of structurally optimized systems. And he investigated sort of a vast range of these materials, from highly defined systems as the cable nets down to granular matter such as sand, in order to see how they can actually physically compute form as the equilibrium state of internal restraints and external forces. So within the contemporary context of design computation, I quite like to think of our work as a possible extension and synthesis of both Alber's experimental research of employing material as a driving force in the creative process, and on the other hand, Otto's scientific rigor in conducting architectural inquiry. So what I will present today are basically 4 fields of research and related projects that focus on materiality, materialization, material structure, and material performance, which may actually allow to think of a more exploratory design culture and integrative material practice of architecture, even though I'm fully aware that at this moment in time we can only offer the kind of merest beginnings of such a way of conducting architecture. So as said, the first chapter will really focus on the notion of materiality, with the aim of showing how such an approach to design computation allows to understand material not as a passive receptor of preconceived form, but rather as an active generator in design. And in order to show how such a kind of approach to design computation allows exploring really new facets, even of relatively mundane building materials, I will focus a large part of the presentation on one of the most familiar materials that we have, which is wood, which is also one of the oldest construction materials. However, it is really important to understand that we are not a kind of wood engineering or kind of timber architecture institute, and we conduct we conduct investigations into a vast range of materials. So, for example, over many years, we have also investigated membrane structures, most recently through the great sort of doctoral research of Sean Alquist at my institute, who actually investigated spatial membranes and is also developing a related software environment for the design and production of complex tension-active structures, which he tests and calibrates through a number of prototypes. And what's really interesting is that more recently he has actually found a way of overcoming the kind of inherent problem when you deal with membrane structures, and that is that you always need this kind of external frames from which you suspend your systems. And he has done so by integrating a bending active frame, which is this carbon fiber rod that you can see that exists in an equilibrium state with the tensile membrane, and by that it becomes actually a self-supporting structure that in this case can be further fine-tuned by an additional layer of system hierarchy, which in this case is introduced through CNC-produced secondary textile articulation. Another example, which is probably situated at the opposite end of the material system spectrum that we work with, is the research work on aggregate structures, who sort of entails investigating the behavior of granular substances with designed macroparticles that can be explored through a combination of machine and material computation. And what is really interesting about this sort of macro granular matter and its underlying physics and material behavior is that these systems combine, on the one hand, the stable character of a solid material, and on the other hand, the smooth adaptability of a fluid, suggesting that the emergent spatial structures can actually be functionally graded, but also rapidly reconfigured. So as I said, all these systems are actually quite interesting. I will still try to focus the next part of the presentation, our work with the material wood, which begs the question, why would one or should sort of relate a kind of innovative approach to design computation to what initially appears as a very archaic building material? On the one hand, there's the more kind of down-to-earth argument that in the light of the environmental challenges that the built environment is facing, it is actually increasingly recognized that there are hardly any other building materials that can rival wood's environmental virtues, because wood is basically a naturally renewable material that holds a very low level of embodied energy and even has a positive carbon footprint. However, in contrast to most other construction materials that are very specifically designed and industrially produced to satisfy the requirements of the building industry, wood, as you all know, grows as the functional tissue of trees, which results in a very differentiated and complex cellular structure. Unfortunately, the design opportunities that are innate in this heterogeneous makeup of wood are usually completely neglected in today's construction practice, and wood is really dumped down to yet just another dimensional building element, particularly in the US, as suggested by this image, where wood is even not referred to as wood any longer, but just as a kind of dimensional building element, such as 2x2, 2x4, which is possibly very emblematic for this disregard of the interesting structure of the material itself. So in contrast to this, we are convinced that computation processes allow for a renewed appreciation of the amazing differentiation, surprising behavioral capacities, and related sort of rich design opportunities that are innate to wood's complex anatomy. And thus, all the research projects that we actually conduct, where we investigate those possibilities, begin with an investigation of the material structure on the microscopic scale. And on that scale, one can really describe wood as a natural fiber composite, because in the various layers of the wood cells, the cellulosic microfibrils function like fibers that are embedded in a matrix of lignin and hemicellulose, and that is reinforced through these kind of cellulosic fibers. So it's also interesting to note that as such, wood shares a whole number of properties with synthetic composite materials that you all know, such as glass fiber, reinforced plastics, for example. And they are all characterized by relatively low stiffness combined with relatively high structural capacity. In other words, that means that these particular elastic properties of wood are especially well suited for construction techniques that employ these material behaviors to form complex, lightweight structures from initially very simple planar elements. Which begs the question how one can really imagine an architecture design process that enables the material behavior to become an active driver in the generation of form, structure, and space. And this is basically a question that we investigated in the first project that I would like to introduce in a bit more detail, which is the ICD ITKE Research Pavilion that we completed in 2010, which was a collaborative undertaking of researchers and students of my institute and the Institute of Jan Knippers, who is a structural engineer. It's maybe also important to mention that all the projects that I will show, except the last one, are developed in a context where engineers and architects and later on also biologists collaborate, usually in a team of about 10 to 12 graduate students that work together on eye level with 5 to 6 doctoral researchers, so that the doctoral researchers can bring in the cutting edge expertise and their actual research, and the students actually get the chance to experiment on a level that would otherwise not really be possible. So at the core of this project was really the awareness that any material has the ability to compute form. And a very good yet relatively straightforward example is the specific figure that a strip of plywood finds once it is actually exposed to a force at one of its support points, as you can nicely see in this image. So your input is very simple. You pull with a given force, and then you actually get for free this relatively complex elastica curve, which in some sort of shape range overlaps with the catenary curve. So despite the fact that this elastic material behavior yields interesting architectural possibilities and even structural advantages, it is hardly ever used in architecture because it usually lies outside of what we can design with our conventional design techniques, including actually most digital ones. In other words, as we as architects usually can simply not draw or model material behavior quite precisely, we cannot design with it. And that's also why there are really only a very few examples of elastically bent architectures. And it may come not as a surprise that vernacular architecture, with its far more immediate relation to material behavior, has recognized their capacity. For example, as you can nicely see in this image, the Madan people in southern Iraq use actually the elastic behavior of bundled reed to construct their houses. And they're very sophisticated with that, so they can actually build a whole number of typologies with these kind of pre-stressed, elastically bent elements. In addition to these more culturally evolved examples, a few technologically derived so-called bending active structures exist, such as, for example, the timber grid shells that were developed by Fray Otto in the 1970s. And here it's really interesting to note that they are initially an entirely flat and regular wooden lattice, as you can see on the top left image, that is assembled on the ground, and only once it is actually jacked up at a few strategic points, it finds its structurally stable double curved form completely by itself, by the way, as a kind of function of the elastic behavior of the employed materials. So our project aimed at further developing this quite often overlooked lineage of bending active architectures. And based on a discussion we had with Frei Otto, we identified two main design research goals for this investigation. The first goal is that we aim for integrating the skin and the structure into one monomaterial bending active system with no need for additional cladding elements. Whereas Frei Otto's timber bridges always were just structure and then you had a membrane skin on top of that. The second innovation that we aimed for was that we wanted to use the elastic behavior of the material not so much to actually generate a global shape as in the Otto's grid shells, but rather employ it to generate sort of more complex, intricate network of locally bent segments. So the project began, as most of our projects do, with a series of physical tests that were calibrated with related computation design simulations that you can see here on the right, which are usually finite element based. So based on these tests, the bending behavior of the material was then embedded in a kind of generative computation design process, which allowed to develop actually a very simple initial structure in which the bending elements sort of provide the kind of modules for a larger sort of arc system. And I think one can actually nicely see that in this actual material simulation, how the system consists of two initially absolutely planar strips that are then connected so that they elastically bend in particular regions that are held in place by related tensile regions. So one can think about this system as a kind of sequence of archery bows almost. And it's interesting that the pre-stress that you put into the system in this elastic bending process increases the structural stiffness of the system. So this is the resultant, what we call behavioral system, which was then transferred into an actual constructional system by informing the behavioral system through a computational process with the constraints of the machine that we were intending to use, which is our industrial robot that we got very new at the time when we did this project, so that all the details are actually automatically generated based on the kind of objective of producing the entire building with this one machine and actually one tool only. So for example, we developed a kind of tension puzzle joint in order to be able to connect strips, segments of limited stock size. Another very critical morphological feature is obviously the articulation of the strip outline itself, as this regulates the overall modulation of the transparency, the enclosure and the exposure of the envelope, as well as the kind of natural lighting conditions that result from the direct and indirect illumination, both for the daylight situation and the artificial illumination at nighttime. It's not very difficult to understand that the most critical detail in terms of construction is obviously where the two strips are connected. And you don't have to be a structural engineer to understand that this is a problematic area, because at that point you get a kind of local weak spot of reduced structural depth. However, we found a way of distributing this kind of local weak spot so that it does not compromise the stability of the global system. And this was actually achieved by letting these kind of local weak spots oscillate along the structure that, as you can nicely see in this paper model here on the left and in the real system on the right. And the oscillation sort of prevents any kind of longer axis of weakness to occur. So in a way, this distribution of the joint points that spatially mediates the material behavior of the plywood lamellas became one of the main drivers in the computation design process. And here, strategically introducing local irregularity really allows to achieve a greater level of global stability. This was corroborated with another finite element analysis that simulates the bending behavior of the initially planar strips and the whole sort of subsequent coupling of the related strip segments, where you can nicely see that ultimately the pavilion really finds its final kind of shape as the equilibrium state of all the interacting elastic elements. So the downside of having this structurally required irregularity is that obviously it sort of results in a vast number of geometrically different parts. In this case, more than 500, which does not pose any longer a problem if you use a digital machine like that, because you can directly manufacture from your files. What I find very interesting about this project is that, in contrast to the substantial intellectual investment in developing the design, computation, and simulation processes, which took about a year's time of 6 PhD researchers, the final system and assembly is actually very straightforward and simple, and also very cheap. In fact, the planar strips simply need to be connected on sides, and then they find their specific shape entirely by themselves. So in other words, one can say that even in full scale on sides, the material itself computes the shape of the pavilion. And this equilibrium state of the pavilion is interesting because it, on the one hand, unfolds a quite unique architectural space, and on the other hand, it remains to be extremely efficient with the employed material resources. Basically because the combination of the pre-stress that results from the elastic bending of the individual elements and the morphological differentiation of the joint locations allows for using only extremely thin plywood strips. In fact, the entire structure that had a diameter of more than 12 meters could be actually constructed by using birch plywood with a thickness of only 6.5 millimeters. So there's not a single element that is thicker than that in this entire pavilion. And this super thin skin is at the same time the load-bearing structure, which actually needed to fulfill the quite stringent regulations of a German building application. That's also important to remember, that we don't build these things in our backyard where we can do what we want. We actually have to go through the full German approval system in order to be able to construct these prototypes, because they are built in a public space, which are actually for Stuttgart very stringent in regards to wind and snow loads. And in this case, it's very interesting that this quite sort of capable material structure is not only the structure, but also the skin, which creates a very interesting sort of play of light through the modulation of the kind of daylight in the kind of sequence of convex and concave undulations of the envelope, which in this case was designed in such a way that it touched the ground topography on the street-facing corner of the public square. And in contrast to that, on the other side, where it actually faces the square, it was lifted up to form an 8-meter wide free-spanning opening. Inside, it was interesting to see that this toroidal space, which on the outside seems to be relatively straightforward geometrically, could never be really perceived in its entirety, which led to a surprising spatial depth that is again further enhanced by the sequence of direct and indirect illumination that results from the undulations of the envelope. So in addition to these explorations of the related architectural possibilities and emergent spatial qualities, the construction of these research pavilions also allows us a more scientific verification of the developed computational design processes, which in this case was actually done by comparing 4 models that you can see here. So on the top right, you can see on the top left, you can see the computation design model. On the top right, the related finite element simulation model. And then here at the bottom is the robot control model. And most critically, on this side, the full-scale, comprehensive laser scan of the building as constructed on site, for which we actually collaborated with an Institute for Geodetic Engineering who repeatedly actually digitized the pavilion, which allowed us to extract from the resulting point clouds the critical measure points that we could overlay with the computation design models, which actually only showed very, very minor deviations. So comparing the results of these kind of generative computation design processes that you can again see here on the top with the very exact measurements of the geometry that the material computed on site, as represented by the 3D scan here at the bottom, in my eyes really indicates that the suggested integration of material behavior and design computation is no longer just an idealized goal, but really a feasible proposition, even on that scale. More importantly, I think the project also quite nicely demonstrates how focusing the computation design process on material behavior rather than geometric shape allows for unfolding performative capacity and material resourcefulness, while at the same time expanding the design space towards formerly unexplored architecture possibilities. So in many ways, this integral design process allows to overcome this kind of discrepancy or dialectic between, let's say, what is kind of high performance in structural regards, and on the other hand, what is architectural performativity in terms of spatial quality and formal expressiveness. And I think also here one can clearly say that material is no longer a passive receptor of shape, but really the active generator of design. So in addition to this design possibilities or in potentials that are inherent in materiality, we are also quite interested in further exploring the possibilities of materialization, which leads us to the second chapter that I would like to introduce. And obviously there's no question that numerically controlled processes already have had a kind of major effect on architectural production. But most often the use of these digital fabrication tools is really of a facilitative rather than a generative character. So that begs the question that if we really aim for overcoming a hierarchical conception of design computation and materialization, how can we systematically capture the specific affordances and constraints that are inherent to almost any digital fabrication environment so that they can become the point of departure for architecture inquiry and systematic design research. And for that, we have investigated also for a number of years now the possible transfer of the mathematical concept of so-called morphospaces from theoretical morphology in biology to computational design and fabrication. In this context, it's quite interesting to note that already in the early 1960s, a paleontologist called David Raub actually published quite a seminal paper in Science in which he presented a series of computer-generated shell forms that you can see here on the left. These are sort of really computationally generated forms in the early 60s. That is around the same time that the first architects ever got their hands on a computer, where biologists were already using the tools in such an advanced way. And what is even more interesting is that he then went on and used the three critical parameters that he kind of employed in order to compute these shell forms and used them as coordinate axes to construct a three-dimensional space that you can see here on the right, into which he then mapped all the shell morphologies that are actually known in biology. So by that, he essentially differentiated between the theoretical morphospace, which is the white cube, which sort of includes all computable forms, and the empirical and the kind of empirical morphospace of all actually existing forms. And it's interesting to note that this has been developed since the 1960s as a kind of concept, a mathematical concept, and has been extended to n-dimensional spaces by now that are capable of mathematically describing not yet existent form. So in the next project, which was again a collaborative undertaking of researchers and students of my institute, the Institute of Building Structures, and other members of our biomedics competence network investigated the transfer of this concept from theoretical morphology to design computation and digital fabrication. At the beginning, that project actually really just investigated how digital production processes allow for an extension of relatively traditional wood jointing techniques by developing robotically fabricated finger joints that actually allow for joining blades at various different angles and even with different thicknesses, resulting in relatively complex blade structures that still maintain the traditional finger joint's key advantage, which is that it does not require any additional mechanical fasteners or adhesives. So based on the specific robot setup that we wanted to use, which in this case included a turntable as a seventh axis, we identified the three critical morphological parameters of these finger joint wood plates, and by actually using a very specific robot fabrication simulation, the min-max ranges for these morphological parameters could actually be established and mapped into what we have termed a machinic morphospace. So within the theoretical morphospace of all geometrically possible plate morphologies, the actual machinic morphospace emerges that only includes the fabricable plates. And in this context, the quote by the biomedic engineer Julian Vincent is actually quite interesting and relevant, who stated that in biology, material is actually expensive, but shape is cheap. And as of today, the opposite was true in the case of technology. So arguably, with robotic fabrication, and especially with a method that allows you to identify what is actually producible versus what is only kind of possible to sort of generate digitally, one could resort to biomedic design strategies as particularly promising design strategies to explore and cover the performative regions of such a machinic morphospace. In order to do so, you really need to understand, again, the structural and material behavior of such finger joints. But yet again, this is not particularly difficult. It's not difficult to imagine that these finger joints are very good in withstanding actually shear forces. That is, like, if the plates want to do this, they're kind of weak if they have to withstand bending forces, because they almost act like hinges, and they have no capacity to withstand any tensile forces. So they're really limited to withstanding these shear forces at the edges. And that poses quite a challenge if you want to design a larger structure from such blades. But it's also interesting to note that there are natural systems that have evolved ways of successfully addressing exactly this challenge. And one example is the sand dollar that you can see here, which is a kind of specific sea urgent that actually has a blade skeleton that consists of discrete polygonal plates, and these plates are connected by stereon projections that are very similar to the finger joints, and they also behave mechanically in a very similar way. So that means that obviously the sand dollar has developed plate morphologies that fully capitalize on the finger joint's structural capacity by evolving shells that actually manage to transfer all the forces that are acting on them, and these are considerable forces because the sand dollar lives in the surf, and transfers all these forces into just normal and shear forces at the edges of its blades. And by that, it almost entirely avoids bending moments at these connections. So with the help of the biologists, we identified 8 relevant biomedic design principles that govern this performative capacity and captured them in algorithmic design rules that we then embedded in a computational process. And this process still allows for quite a high degree of spatial modulation, for example, through the topological transformations of infolding and splitting that you can see in these slides, while at the same time they also ensure consistency with the quite complex reciprocities between the producible and the performative, which was also iteratively tested and calibrated. So the resultant computation design process really enables the designer to explore this machinic morphospace of the physically producible through the filter of the biometric rules, which in concert with other spatial and contextual criteria leads to a highly specific blade morphology. And this articulation of the envelope results in quite a high structure performance, which was again also numerically verified, and quite a distinctive architectural character, which both stem from the morphological differentiation of the blade system. And again, this differentiation requires the fabrication of, in this case, more than 850 different blades with more than 100,000 different finger joints, of which you can see here a spatial mapping of the robot toolpaths. And you can imagine that this only actually makes sense if the logics of materialization with such a robot are an integral part of the design process from the initial, from the beginning on, because in this case it's relatively involving to go through all the topological sorting of the blades, how they relate to each other, and how you actually automatically transfer all that into wood working robot control code. In the end, the blades are all produced in this manner. Here the blade is already trimmed by the robot, and then the robot actually finishes the blade by adding some miters at the edges, and then it cuts the finger joints in one go, which means that the precision of the joint, as you can nicely see here, is reflected by the precision of the tool, which is in the sub tenths of a millimeter range. This was also enabled by the industrial partner that developed that tool, which is very unique because it can not only cut at the flanges, it can also cut at the tip, which is obviously a prerequisite in order to do this manufacturing process. So again, in contrast to the considerable complexity of the design process, and especially the generation of the robot control code for this absolutely non-standard 7-axis setup, the resulting system is again surprisingly simple and cheap. Basically, you end up with this huge puzzle of finger joint blades that are or that can be assembled into larger modules without the need for any special tools or technical equipment. And although all the individual blades are very thin, the modules ultimately demonstrate a considerable structural capacity while remaining extremely lightweight. And despite the vast range of individual blade morphologies and the fact that we didn't actually do any prototyping, in fact, the first blades that we manufactured ended up in the pavilion due to the time constraints that we worked with, we were still quite confident that we could build the final shell in a very unorthodox manner, which is from the bottom up. This is something that you would never do in building construction, because if you build a shell like this and your last piece doesn't fit, there's no way to actually amending that situation. Usually you support the entire shell, then you do the tolerance compensation, and then you kind of bolt it together. Nevertheless, we were quite convinced that our robot was precise, and the assembly process went relatively smooth, which ultimately was also verified by again doing a full-scale laser scan of the pieces that allowed us to verify the tolerances both on the level of the actual joints and on the level of the fitting of the modules. What is probably more interesting is that the resulting lightweight modular wood shell again demonstrates both the structural capacity and the architectural potential of a system that exclusively consists of extremely thin birch plywood plates that are only connected by these robotically fabricated finger joints. So based on the systematic exploration of the machinic morphospace, the system reveals the spatial capacity to also overcome the usually quite hermetic character of shell architectures. For example, enabling the system to come back onto itself creates this oculus that visually connects the interior with the surrounding park, which also results in two quite distinct spaces. On the one hand, a truly internal space that is characterized by the perforation of the inner skin layer that is actually required for the assembly of the double layers modules, and also a kind of interstitial space where the two layers are pulled apart and the structural logic is revealed, but no longer a kind of perforation is acquired. And the kind of differentiation of the truly internal space versus the interstitial space is nicely enhanced by the indirect LED illumination of the internal spaces. And as the structural performance here really results from each element's highly specific morphological response to the forces that it is exposed to, the entire pavilion with a diameter of more than 12 meters and a height of more than 5 meters could be again built using only extremely thin plywood plates. Again, all the plates, without any exceptions, have only a thickness of 6.5 millimeters, which means that it is an extremely lightweight and materially efficient structure that actually manages to enclose more than 200 cubic meters of space with only 2 cubic meters of wood. So it's a kind of ratio of more than 1 to 100. And what is also interesting is that this sort of non-programmed, semi-interior urban space attracted all kinds of informal urban activities and proved to be a very popular meeting point, both at lunch hours and at night times, where all kinds of things took place here, from sort of ad hoc rap concerts to that thing becoming a kind of very popular playground for kids, actually. Which is frightening if you think that you have a kid hanging in 5 meters height on a 6.5 millimeter plywood plate, and sometimes 10 of them at the same time. I think, again, overall, the project quite nicely shows that embedding the logics of materialization in a morphogenetic computation process really enables the designer to offset the conventional economies of construction. Here, the substantial intellectual investment in the design process results in a surprisingly simple yet novel architectural system that at the same time offers a high level of structural performance and related material efficiency, while at the same time affords a kind of new level of architectural performativity. What is also interesting to note is that the cent dollar and this construction system still follows relatively conventional logics of building construction, where a larger shell is built up from smaller elements. And it's interesting to note that nature very rarely operates in this mode. Usually, in biological systems, a clear distinction between the element and the overall structure, or even a clear distinction between what is material and what is structure, is not really possible. Usually, in biological systems, materiality is really constructed as an integrative material structure of continuous elements that are organized across multiple scales of hierarchy. And this is sort of the third chapter of our investigations that I would like to introduce again along our most recent research pavilion, which was a kind of collaborative effort between a whole number of partners involving the structural engineers from Jan Knipper's Institute again, but also biologists from the departments of evolutionary biology and paleontology of the University of Tübingen, and actually textile and process engineers from the Institute of Textile Technology and Process Engineering at the ITV Denkendorf. So different to the previous pavilions, which were all shells that are built up for differentiated yet discrete modular elements, in this project we were really interested in a kind of opposite approach of producing an entirely continuous shell in which the material structure itself is actually differentiated through robotic fabrication. And an interesting example of a natural system that operates like that is the exoskeleton of the American lobster, which you can see here in its cooked state. That's why it's already red. If you ever had a lobster meal, you may have realized that there are different parts of the lobster actually have very different mechanical properties. For example, the crusher claws are very stiff and strong, whereas the tail has this kind of connective elements that are actually very elastic. But it's interesting to note that all these kind of elements are in the end made up from exactly the same material. And this material is again a natural composite material consisting of chitin fibers that are embedded in a protein matrix, that are organized across several layers of hierarchy, and that obtain their different material behaviors by or due to a kind of differentiation in the fiber layout on the microscopic level. So the lobster manages to achieve very, very different material properties from exactly the same material by arranging the material differently. And this is basically the engineering diagram of your experience having a lobster meal, which shows that the pincher claw or the crusher claw have very different mechanical properties as compared to these connective membranes. So in collaboration with the biologists and the experts in biomechanics, our students and researchers carefully investigated different parts of the lobster shell, which they studied under the microscope to identify different fiber organizations, such as strongly parallel fiber arrangements or more helicoidal fiber structures that serve more as kind of division between the inside and the outside of the lobster exoskeleton. Because the logics of these materials are quite closely related to technological composite materials that we know as, for example, glass or carbon fiber composites. And we also investigated innovative ways of working or fabricating structures with these synthetic composites, such as, for example, the 3DL technology developed by North Thales. This is not so new anymore. It has been done by 10 years. It's kind of the process of how advanced racing yacht sails are produced by laying the individual fibers exactly where the forces flow. Obviously, these kind of processes are not really suited for architecture construction because they always require an extensive and incredibly elaborate mold onto which the fibers can be laid. So in contrast to that, we were interested in developing a process of what we call robotic filament winding, where the kind of robot, in the process of winding the fibers, actually produces its own formwork on which then the structural fibers are actually laid in a subsequent sort of step of production. So this is an initial prototype where you can see how by limiting the kind of formwork or scaffold just to this simple linear framework, you can actually produce a complex shell as the kind of starting point for subsequent processes of filament winding. So having established the basic robot programming logics for that, which are fairly intricate, because if you want to do this properly, you need to sort of monitor the pre-stress in the fiber at each moment in time when you lay the fiber. And having also investigated how these materials, the resulting materials, really behave, because here you can obviously not any longer look up the material behavior in a textbook. You literally have to test the mechanical properties resulting from your fabrication process. We were able to identify or relate these material capacities to the biological principles, which then resulted in different fibrous organizations, for example, in more strongly kind of unidirectional carbon fiber arrangements at the support point, which are very similar to the kind of unidirectional fiber layouts in concentrated stress situations in a lobster shell, or more helicoidal glass fiber organizations on the shell's closed sides that are very similar to the helicoidal fibrous arrangements in the cuticula of the lobster. All this was iteratively checked through digital simulations so that we were able to develop a syntax of fiber placement processes that allow to articulate different architectural situations, such as this entrance location here, or a roof morphology, which then resulted in a kind of comprehensive method for developing a related computation design technique that unfolds actually quite a rich repertoire of possible architectural morphologies, while at the same time remaining fully coherent with the logics and constraints of the robot filament winding process, which was again corroborated with simulating the process iteratively. Not only in regards to its fabrication, but also in regards to the change in material property, in material behavior in the fabrication process. As you can imagine, the relation between the geometry to be produced, the fibers that you lay onto that, and then how the fibers begin to interact in the manufacturing process is relatively complicated. And because of that, the entire manufacturing process needed to be actually simulated with finite element analysis in order to allow to exploit the kind of material self-organization in space on the initial framework to become a kind of a mold for the subsequent carbon fiber placement. This was also iteratively optimized in order to reduce the required shell depth. And obviously with this project, we left a little bit the comfort zone of our laboratory because we could not produce this kind of rather challenging project inside the lab. We had to move outside and actually set up a fabrication system which looked like this. So you have the robot, which is a much larger robot than the one that we use for the other pavilions, which has a 4-meter long arm sitting on a 2-meter tall pedestal, which is connected in terms of its control to a turntable on which a kind of temporary steel scaffold is mounted. Then we use the robot to scan the steel scaffold, which allowed us to rapidly adjust the computational winding process, which meant that one late night last August we could actually begin the production process. This whole structure begins to rotate, and then the robot places the fibers onto the spinning or revolving formwork. It's more or less a fully automated process, and a couple of days later it looks like this, where you can see that the initial layer of glass fiber is already built up, and then the far more complex geometry of the carbon fiber that you can nicely see here is laid onto these initial glass fiber surfaces. And you can see that this distinctive curved shape of the carbon fiber requires you to have a very good understanding of how the material systems begin to interact in this continuous winding process. This is still a dry run, so the fibers are not yet saturated with resin. In the actual production process, the setup looks like this. On the left-hand side, you can see, in this case, the glass fiber rovings. Rovings are fibers that are all oriented in one way, run through a resin bath, and then it's actually laid onto the turning scaffold by the robot, as you can nicely see in this video. So the fibers are saturated with resin, and the curing time of the resin is set in such a way that it remains kind of sticky long enough so that you can actually build up a continuous shell where the kind of layers always properly bond onto each other. For that, again, the most critical aspect in the production is the pre-stress in the fiber. Because if the pre-stress is not properly calibrated, you don't get the proper bond between the fibers, and then you don't end up with one structurally capable shell, but with very thin, very unstable shells. You can see a guy in there that does a bit of quality control. It's not a nice job because you have resin dripping onto you the entire time. But that's the level of dedication that you need in order to do these kind of projects. The entire production time amounts to about 120 hours of fabrication. And in total, the structure consists out of about 60 kilometers of glass and carbon fiber. So I think in many ways this project quite nicely shows how digital fabrication begins to significantly expand the design space of the architect beyond the design of form, space, and structure towards the actual processes from which space, form, and structure are derived. And this includes the development and exploration of novel material and construction systems. As mentioned here, the final shell consists of many kilometers of these robotically laid carbon and glass fibers, but in the end, the final shell is only 4 millimeters thin and extremely lightweight. Actually, in Germany, there exists a kind of benchmarking for lightweight structures where everything that is below 50 kilograms per square meter is considered to be lightweight. This thing weighs less than 5 kilograms per square meter and is thus sort of categorized as ultra lightweight, which always means that our main problem is keeping these things attached to the ground because they tend to just fly away. I think what is more important is that this extreme level of lightweightness here really registers also as a kind of visual feature inside where the transparency and the intricacy of the resulting surfaces can be conceived that almost disappear in the interior view. So I think synthesizing the capability of the machine with building up the material structure itself, the transparent glass fiber surfaces, and especially the black carbon fiber rowings really allow to perceive the logic of the differentiated fibrous organizations within this translucent envelope, all forming one continuously constructed materiality that does not require any additional elements. So here the construction logic really establishes both a super thin yet highly performative skin structure and a novel repertoire of architecture morphologies and tectonics, which again nicely allows to sort of resolve this seeming dialectic in contemporary architecture between what is architecturally performative and has a certain level of structure performance. So after having introduced how one can actually construct materiality in such a continuous sort of shell structure, I will introduce the last chapter of our design research, which is investigating how you can inject into this sort of build-up of synthetic materiality a level of material performance, which is almost like an embedded capacity to respond to external stimuli. And for that, I will return once more to the material of wood, because we have investigated actually in a whole range of projects over the last 6 years the possibility of utilizing the inherent environmental responsiveness of wood in order to build sort of climate responsive architectures. And this is based on the recognition that wood is obviously a hygroscopic material, which means that it maintains its moisture content in equilibrium with the surrounding relative humidity. And the related processes of adsorbing and desorbing water molecules on the molecular level actually affect the microfibrillar structure that makes up wood which results in both a change in strength and a differential change of dimensions. And usually we experience this dimensional instability of wood as a kind of deficiency. And one could argue that we have more than a couple of thousand years of craftsmanship that really try to overcome this hygroscopic inherent material behavior of wood in order to avoid jam drawers or wobbly parquet floors. And in fact, we invest more than 70% of the energy in current wood processing to suppress this inherent material behavior. And we do this by actually kiln drying the wood, which you can see in this large column up here. And in that way, we try to kind of reduce the moisture content within the cell walls to a level of 6 or 7%, hoping that that stabilizes the dimension of wood until it's actually used on the building site. So in this project, or in these projects, we were interested in doing somewhat exactly the opposite by exploring this hygroscopic capacity of wood as a climate responsive characteristic. And typically, climate responsiveness in architecture is conceived as a technical function that is enabled by myriad mechanical and electronic devices. So in contrast to this superimposition of high-tech equipment on otherwise usually quite inert and dumb construction materials, our approach investigated a fundamentally different no-tech strategy where the climate responsiveness is quite literally ingrained in the material itself. And again, there are interesting natural examples of such an embedded responsiveness, and one is the spruce cone, which, as some of you may know, grows in a moist, closed state that you can see on the left-hand side. Then it falls off the tree, and once the surrounding microclimatic conditions have reached a suitable level of relative humidity, the scales actually automatically open up and the seeds are released. And all this happens due to the differential shrinkage of the fibrous structure during a reduction in moisture content. So in a sense, the spruce cone has found a way to translate the dimensional instability of this fibrous cellulosic and lignin composite to translate the kind of dimensional instability into shape change. So based on this principle, we developed a climate responsive composite element in which actually wood veneer, I think you should change your battery, in which wood veneer constitutes the reactive layer. So what really happens here is what you can nicely see in this movie. You have a very simple piece of composite material in which the intelligent part is still wood, and this piece actually changes its shape according to different levels of relative humidity that you can see here on the hygrometer reading at the bottom. And we have tested this autonomous passive shape chains over many hundred cycles, and we have also tested its robustness with all kinds of impact testing. And more recently, we even have managed to develop ways of physically programming this responsive behavior so that we can actually trigger the material to behave almost in completely opposite ways. So for example, in this video, you can see two samples that are made up from exactly the same material, assembled in exactly the same fashion, and they're exposed to exactly the same changes in relative humidity, yet they behave in exactly the opposite manner. One actually closing with an increase in relative humidity and the other one opening. And this is because we can actually physically program the behavior in the fabrication process. And we have tested that in a number of full-scale functional mock-ups and verified the coherency and reliability of this movement in both laboratory tests and quite an extensive long-term test that we have conducted in outdoor conditions for more than 2 years by now, actually on top of our high-rise university building, that we monitor the system and the environmental conditions every 15 minutes. And we can happily report that the system still performs absolutely faultlessly. Every time rain approaches, the humidity level automatically increases. This is a sort of a physical law, which means that the system reliably closes, and once the sun comes out, it opens again, and it has done so over many thousand cycles by now without showing actually any physical fatigue. It also hasn't actually shown any level of decay, which is due to two facts. One is that there's this protective composite layer which protects it from UV light, and the other is that the wood we are using has an inherent level of acid content which prevents actually mold to affect the structure. So at the same time as conducting these long-term experiments, we have investigated ways of accounting for the more complex reciprocity of the individual element as well as the overall system responsiveness by developing a more adaptive system and related computation design process in order to derive more sort of specific system morphologies. And in this process, the surface geometry is actually algorithmically generated and controlled through a number of parameters and constraints based on the actual material's anatomy that we're going to use and its characteristics and behavior, which resulted in a fully functional prototype that you can see here, where the veneer composite pieces are really at the same time the sensor, the motor, and the regulating elements, all compressed into this very simple and very cheap, actually, passively responsive element. So given a change in relative humidity, as you can see here, the system opens and closes with no need for any supply of external energy or any kind of additional mechanical or electronic control. Here the kind of responsiveness is quite literally ingrained in the material itself. And as we speak, we have just completed a first full-scale pavilion project for the permanent collection of the Frog Center in Orléans that features a skin like this, which actually on rainy days with relatively high ambient humidity has a fully closed envelope that opens once the sun comes out and the weather changes. And I think this is a kind of interesting architectural phenomenon because beyond the merely functional requirements of a kind of climate responsive skin, this autonomous passive actuation of the surface provides for quite a unique convergence of our environmental and spatial experiences. Unfortunately, I'm not supposed to show any more detailed explanation of that project until it's released in September. But in the meantime, we had also the chance to develop this system further based on a commission by the Centre Pompidou in Paris for an installation for their permanent collection, which we named Hygroscope Metrosensitive Morphology. And in many ways, it's interesting that the Centre Pompidou embodies the architectural opposite of our approach. One can actually argue that the building celebrates the very technology that maintains the stable interior climate as one of its key architectural features. Most of the stuff that you see on this image is actually the climate conditioning equipment that maintains the stable climate inside. And thus, our concept for this installation was to insert into the space of the Centre Pompidou, which is arguably one of the most stable climates in the world, actually always maintaining exactly 21 degrees Celsius and about 50% relative humidity in order to protect all the Picassos that are on the 3rd and 4th floor. And we wanted to sort of inject into that space at the bottom where this thing is actually exhibited a kind of virtual extension of the exterior climate in the form of a large display case in which we actually reproduce the dynamics of the external environment. So situated within this glass case, the movement of our meteorosensitive morphology allows to experience the subtle humidity fluctuations that form part of our everyday life, but usually completely escape our spatial perception. And in this case, the specific system morphology was actually computation derived based on the one hand, the system intrinsic material variables, that is the anatomy of the cellular structure of the pieces that we wanted to use, and on the other hand, the system extrinsic environmental conditions, which were simulated by the climate engineers of our project partners in this case, which was the company Transolar Climate Engineering in Stuttgart. And I think in their simulation, you can nicely see that even in a kind of completely controlled environment as this glass case, the distribution of the levels of humidity is completely heterogeneous. And this heterogeneity was actually driving the algorithmic procedure that then derived the specific system morphology and also included the kind of movement of the structure while it undergoes this kind of exposure to different climatic influences. We usually also tend to build all these structures in-house, which in this case entailed a fairly elaborate sort of robotic fabrication process. And we also produced all the thousands of climate responsive elements, which entails actually climate monitoring, not only during the fabrication state of the material, but also through all subsequent processes of production and even transport. And in this case, we also had the interesting job of basically, because we couldn't find a company that was willing to do the job for us, of building this custom designed climate control unit that is a kind of mini Centre Pompidou underneath the display case that somewhat undoes what the big Centre Pompidou does in terms of climate conditioning. We actually kind of avoided painting the pipes also blue, because that would be too cheesy, and it took quite a long time to actually get all this properly running, which required sort of a whole series of nights adjusting the thing in place in the Pompidou, actually calibrating the system with their air conditioning unit. But in the end, the final installation explores quite nicely, I think, a novel mode of responsive architecture through the unfolding of material inherent capacities. Here, the material continuously recomputes form and performance in feedback with its microenvironment. So within the glass case, the climate corresponds with an accelerated database of the relative humidity level in Paris, and thus I think the case functions less as a separation from the interior space of the Pompidou, but rather as a virtual connection to the outside environment. And in this way, the perception of the ever-changing and locally varied environmental dynamics is intensified through the silent movement of this responsive morphology. So, in many ways, the installation provides a visual experience and almost a kind of tactile experience of the subtle variations in humidity levels that we hardly ever consciously perceive. Suspended within the humidity control glass case, the system responds to the climate fluctuations, and a mere increase in relative humidity triggers the system to change its surface porosity to almost breathe and ventilate the moisture-saturated air. And here, really, the wooden morphology, which again is really just a very simple construct that is only consisting out of these wooden elements and a bit of composite material, embodies the capacity to sense, actuate, and respond with no need for any additional mechanical or electronic equipment, or even the supply of any external environment, sort of energy. And I think one can really say that here, the material itself is the machine. That usually comes with sound, but I think you can also see it simply on the visual level. So here you can see how the structure actually opens and closes within this kind of display case at the Pompidou. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achim. A bit of energy left for some questions?
Always.
Any questions for Achim?
Well, first, congratulations, amazing works. There's an irony, you have a huge structure to enormous amount of energy to change the climate inside the Pompidou, and then you have a big machine to change it back to prove that something can be changed without the use of energy. But actually, my question is, the wood has this like, normally you have this machine to remove the humidity from the wood, so it would take a while. What's the time that it takes to change these petals of wood? Like, is it accelerated, the video, or like is it slow, or actually is this the real speed you showed?
The video is accelerated, but the actual movement, the opening can actually happen in 20 seconds, and the closure takes about 2 minutes.
And
but I think it's important to realize that relative humidity outside never changes that fast. So while the system can do that, if you manage to change the relative humidity fast enough, I think we very much enjoyed the fact that it's actually something that happens in the Pompidou, in the case of the Pompidou, because it's calibrated with the outside environment. No? It's very interesting that it actually changes at a speed that is not visually perceptible, because you walk around walk through the exhibition, you look at the thing, you think it's static, you come back and it has changed. And I think kind of indicates to you on a more subtle level than seeing something that does continuously something like this, the kind of environmental changes that we're usually not very sensitive to. It's very interesting to note that relative humidity is something that we experience only in the extreme. If it's really high humidity, we experience that. But we are not as sensitive to humidity as we are, for example, to temperature, where we can perceive a tenth of a degree of difference in temperature immediately. To come back to your first part of the question, obviously there is a certain level of irony in sort of intervening within the super stable environment of the Pompidou and having to build all this machine to actually show what this very simple piece of material could actually do if you would expose it to the outside environment. But then again, I think it's fantastic that one can actually test these ideas in the context of an arts installation where the curators were far more, let's say, daring in having something in their exhibition as opposed to your typical sort of funding structures for research projects like this. No? I think it's also important to say that we, and especially our collaborators, the climate engineers at Transolar, were absolutely convinced that you can build the thing without the glass case, because you can actually modulate relative humidity very locally. So we had all kinds of other ideas of having actually almost like a vapor shower that only locally affects the piece. But the Pompidou had this, obviously, kind of extremely strict policy about anything that emits humidity into the space, because they have all these other nice pieces of art, and you don't want to have a kind of Picasso crumbling up the wall because there's an excess level of humidity. Although we also showed them that this thing is actually emitting probably a tenth of the humidity than all the kind of people did that came to the opening. There were about 1,000 people in the space for the opening, and if you figure out that one person emits about 100 milligrams of water per hour, this crowd emitted far more humidity than our machine could ever do in the kind of worst case scenario. So I think there's a kind of certain irrationality in being so protective about humidity release. On the other hand, it's a kind of institution, a governmental institution that basically just has to stick to their guidelines. So, and in the end, I think I quite enjoy the fact that it had to be so excessive in terms of its technical equipment to show something that is so simple, and that it would just work beautifully if you opened the window.
How thick is it? It works with 2 layers of wood. It's like 100% wood, or for resin. How thick is the?
I can't tell you how it exactly works, because that would make the PhD student that works on that material, has been working on that for more than 5 years now, very unhappy. But the intelligent part is only wood. Everything else is only protective, and it really kind of withstands significant mechanical forces. Basically, there are these tests for facade materials where you hit it with a hammer, and then the whole thing bends this way. One humidity cycle later, it goes back into the initial position, just keeps working.
Well, thank you. The presentation was very exciting, as well as the research, the behavioral materials, all that you showed. I'm wondering a little bit, as most of what you showed were pavilions, right? Which is a very interesting area of experimenting, right? And most of your structures are open spaces, shell-like structures, which are great, very elegant and very interesting. I'm curious about how would you move into another kind of experimentation? I mean, another kind of tectonics, another kind of structures, from the pavilion to the next coming space or project, more related maybe to other programs, housing possibly, other kind of fabrication elements that in a way demand kind of a different approach in terms of how the space is used in relation to the structure, the element, and of course the parameters that you showed. I mean, I'm curious about the next shift, the next step. How would that be?
I mean, we use these pavilions very, let's say, strategically as demonstrators of what we can actually do if we sort of exercise this research in an academic situation. But within the kind of funding situation of Germany, you need to have these demonstrators in order to move on to the next stage. And we are currently actually working on, for example, a kind of permanent, much larger scale building that was actually will be a follow-up project of the second wood shell structure, which then has to fulfill all the architectural requirements of having also integrated facade, insulation, sort of structural stability, and all these things. So we are trying to make an effort to move into the second step, and we have managed to sort of land the first project where we can actually do this. Where we also, and this is very important for us, We are not actually, as the School of Architecture, we don't show up as the general contractors who do the design, the fabrication, the building, everything, but where we actually really do the critical research, and then actually the robotic fabrication takes place within a kind of, will take place at a professional timber manufacturer. So they actually get the robots to work with these materials so that we can show that what we are trying to innovate with on the level of academia ultimately leads to innovation for example, building contractors. And they obviously are, and then we're obviously also interested in building these more permanent structures, which we now have the chance of doing with this whole thing. On the other hand, I think it's also important to be, while we're trying to consciously seek these opportunities, to be quite patient with these processes. Because I think, I mean, for me, an interesting example in regards to the importance of the pavilion as a site for architecture inquiry is the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies, who was actually designed as an open space. No kind of environmental threshold. It didn't have any purpose. You know, there's this nice story that when Mies got commissioned to design this pavilion, he called up the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Germany, who was responsible for this pavilion, and said, so what program should it have? And they say, no program. The pavilion is the exhibit sort of itself, which was quite a struggle for Mies, being a kind of functionalist at heart, to build something that only has the purpose of exhibiting itself. Still, it went on to become one of the decisive buildings for modernist architecture. So I think sometimes it's also important to sort of take full advantage of this quite unique and special characteristic of the kind of architectural type of the pavilion. And I think it's also important that one has a certain level of patience in conducting this research, and one should not expect, or let's say, one should not feel disappointed if not next year there's a high-rise building that is built by a robot weaving carbon fiber. You know? I think the innovation cycles are just relatively slow in the building sector.
Yeah, in this sense, I think that the Mies Pavilion was displaying glass, the German industry on glass, the most biggest and the most advanced glass in the 20s. So in this sense, it's very close to your research on materials. No, it's a pavilion that display and is built about research on materials. If my question was, so I have several questions because your work is amazing, but used a couple of these. Do you get patents from every one of these research, every one of this pavilion? Because it's very intense, I imagine that the whole research could be patented as a system.
We have a couple of patents, but not for anything that I've shown now. So with all this stuff, we are more believing in an open source culture in architecture, where we think that in order to have an impact, it would be counterproductive to actually patent any of that. The university has a very different view on that matter, actually. So we occasionally, we have a couple of patents, but they are more in terms of the actual underlying fabrication processes, less in the kind of systems that are developed. And but obviously the universities are very keen on patenting everything. You know? So it's a constant struggle with them actually to introduce this idea of open source innovation.
And the last question was on this, the second pavilion, the second research. I think that how could the people, I think it's the pavilion where the people has the manual intervention in its construction. So the mounting of the pavilion with the joints, the hexagon and heptagon, how it could be so precise with manual construction of it. I mean, in mounting that, which kind of rules do they have, or scaffolding, something like that?
There's no rules. It's like building a puzzle, because if you build up a puzzle, it's also precise. No? The system is self-correcting. The pieces, because it's a three-dimensional system, the plates only fit if the overall thing is absolutely precise. So,
it's amazing.
Well, that's the interesting thing, that you have this fairly elaborate process, and actually really the kind of robot control code for this thing was something that was fairly intense, because once you leave 6-axis robotics towards 7-axis and more, you are in custom programming sort of territory. And especially also there are no precedents for this uniquely developed tool. But then the advantage is that you invest a lot of sort of effort into the prefabrication of the element, but everything down the line is actually extremely simple. I mean, it's unskilled labor, students. Sorry. I mean, unskilled in terms of highly, I mean, there's no equipment and no scaffolding, nothing, no? And that was also why we really tried to build it up from the bottom, which actually was really risky. Because even if just, I mean, we scanned the foundations before we actually designed the thing, so that we really exactly knew where to put the stuff. But yet again, if there would be a gap of a couple of millimeters at the top, the thing would just slide through, no? But I think that's the kind of shift in the entire conception of how you think about tectonics, where the notion of tolerance, which was driving all the detailing up to now, is all about tolerances, if you look at details in current building construction. And now we shift towards a paradigm where sort of tolerances are absorbed in the intelligence of the system, which is obviously giving the status of giving the detail a completely different status in your design thinking process.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the presentations and congratulations. There are a number of questions I would like to ask you, but let me try two of them. One is very specific, which is I missed the logic of the form that supports the moving small elements in the Pompidou piece. I just missed. Maybe I was taking notes or looking at something else, and I missed what is the logic that makes the supporting form. You know. That's one, and then the other one has to do is a more, I guess, a speculative question, is whether you think your robots are now ready or are perfectly able to build an Stradivarius. Could they do it? Sound like an Stradivarius.
I start with the first question, which is simpler to answer. I mean, the idea with the global shape of the Pompidou is that there's an underlying algorithmic system which in a completely homogeneous environment would produce a completely regular structure. And then there's the kind of simulation of the, and this is actually really a proper simulation of the humidity being injected into the case. You get these turbulences, and you get, even in this controlled environment, a very heterogeneous environment. And this heterogeneity of the humidity levels triggers the system to change, which then triggers the humidity to actually change, because there's this kind of reciprocal relation between the two. It's based on the simulation of the heterogeneity of the humidity levels within the case.
At the side of the box.
Within the box, exactly within the box.
Made in wood.
Sorry?
But then built in wood. Formed the shape.
Well, also the interaction between the wooden shape and the actual humidity was modeled, because you could see that in the simulation there was the material element. That was the first part. Second part is that that would be beyond our ambition, because I think it's really not about these robots or fabrication processes. We don't consider them as something that is sort of a mechanization of or a kind of superior level of mechanization. we actually just use them in a very opportunistic manner. We have robots because that's the cheapest piece of equipment we could get. That still makes sense within an industrial setting. Simply because a robot costs about 70,000 euros and a kind of professional timber joinery machine that you would usually use in order to do wood machining costs about €500,000. It costs about €500,000. So the robot is cheap, it's faster, it's more reliable, and that's the most interesting aspect. The robot is a generic piece of hardware that only becomes specific through the software and its effectors, which obviously is quite a paradigm change in CNC production. So I think this is the kind of very, let's say that's the kind of opportunistic, basic objective of using a robot. That sort of embeds our research within the realities of production. It's not that we sort of fetishize the machine as kind of superior piece of equipment or something like this.
I think it's a particularly interesting point, and I was noticing the transition between the wooden pavilions and the fibrous one, no? And of course in the wooden pavilions, which were mainly component driven, like the robot just felt really kind of comfortable, you know, doing his own components and then assembly. But somehow when you moved into this idea of kind of one piece continuously woven situation, then of course First, it was the need to go out of the usual environment. You actually build a whole full environment for the robot to work, and in fact the rotating platform was a pretty substantial part. So I was wondering whether in that new research trajectory you are thinking about, in fact, moving on from the robot itself, or perhaps creating a coordination of robots, or, you know, a new type of robotic machine that you have to design to keep pursuing this idea.
I mean, that's one of the areas of our interest is obviously what is the next generation of machines now that the industrial robot as we have it, as you have it out there, is 40 years old. There must be something that will follow on from that. But I think we see that in a couple of steps. So for the pavilion that we're actually constructing right now, we actually use two robots that interact with each other. That is an interesting area for research, sort of multiple robots interacting. Another line of research that we use, for example, for the aggregate structures is that we have no longer offline programming of robots, but online programming. So the robot knows what it does, and it sort of begins to adjust to that. It's not sort of just following a kind of pre-programmed sequence. And then obviously the transition from the kind of mass-produced machine, which is the industrial robot, to something that will become again more sort of specific, almost like an entire fabrication environment, would be the logical next step. But I think in the same way as we still use wood, although it has been around for a couple of thousand years as a kind of construction material, and you can still find arguably novel characteristics, it's also not that we feel the urge that we need to jump onto the next thing because it's hot and new and whatever. No? So I think there's still a bit of mileage left in the industrial robot. But it's definitely also an interesting question of how you can actually transfer these logics into other kinds of machineries.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your presentation. I mean, I think we were more or less all aware of your work, but the important thing of the presentation of today is to really get into the detail of each one of the projects, and I think that has been really educative and really nice in today's talk. I would like to focus to the third project, to your interactive pavilion, because I think that the fact of the programmable matter is is an issue that is it's now occurs. No, digital fabrication has been really treated for a long time, and there are many things occurring. But the issue of programmable matter, I think it is a field of still very open with research. I remember like 3 years ago when we did an exhibition about in the Design Museum of Barcelona about digital fabrication, and we were speaking with Neil Gerstenfeld of MIT from Center of Bit and Atoms. He was saying, yeah, cool, 3D printing is very cool, but guys, the future is the programmable matter. So he was very, very convinced. Now there's already a department there, this Skylar TB, that he's working a lot with all this idea, no? But how do you, my question, and I don't know if it is a question, it's rather more like an observation, that on the one hand, we are trying to embed intelligence into our objects. We are trying to transform our rigid objects or buildings into more interactive and into more like, let's say, living organisms, no? And for that, we usually use sensors and actuators, and we work with inputs and outputs. But when it comes to the embedded intelligence in the molecular scale of the material, then all of a sudden this kind of technology is useless in a way. No, I mean it's already a step further from all this technology of communication and electronic technology, passing to the molecular scale of the material, which has the biological principles and how you can really control it into change. The final performance, no? So do you think that this is the future of architecture, or how quick do you see this happening into real scale buildings, or what do you think about it? Or it's not like a question, it's more like an observation. So.
Well, I think usually when we talk or the notion of programmable matter really refers to sort of a nanoscale engineering, no? Because that's also the level on which natural materials begin to self-organize. I think there's definitely, first of all, I think that probably within our lifetime there will be some, let's say, convergence between sort of technological production and synthetic biology. There's no question that this will happen. It's kind of happening on many levels already. But I think, and I think that's definitely interesting, but it's not our key area of research. I would say what we are interested in is not this sort of long-term perspective. It's more sort of the mid-term perspective of how we can actually take advantage of these technologies that we have at our disposal, but how they can also become relevant for architecture within our lifetime. This is maybe also a bit opportunistic, yeah. But I think it's also a bit a cultural issue, no? I think at the MIT, you're allowed to have the grand ideas, or you're actually supposed to have the grand ideas that will change the world. Maybe they won't go on and don't change anything, but that's kind of the kind of baseline on which you have to operate. Whereas in Germany, it's kind of a slightly different context, where if something is not producible tomorrow, it's usually useless. Sorry for that, but so I think what we try to do is sort of finding a kind of, I think within, and I think this is also important, is that within a kind of cultural setting, and I think there are all different schools, institutions have their cultural, very specific sort of inherent culture. We try to actually sort of understand that in our region, in the place that we operate, there is a very strong manufacturing culture, and we try to see what is the future of that. Clearly, there will be this additional line where actually synthetic biology begins to merge, etc., etc., etc. But I think for the moment, I see a greater relevance in sort of almost tapping into that existing pool of innovation that exists in manufacturing already, rather than thinking about what is going to happen in the next 1,000 years. So that's the kind of personal bias.
It's already happening, eh? I mean, there are already
the guys,
furniture that they...
The guys
it's
that...
happening in the industrial design, let's say, scale.
I mean, the guys that we work with, that the Institute for Control Engineering is affiliated with Fraunhofer Institute, who actually makes most of their money by printing skin, literally human skin, which you can now buy for, I think, 50 euros per square centimeter, which is supposedly a nice income if you address the cosmetic industry with that. So I think this is happening also around the corner, but I think and I think I'm also aware that it begins to have an impact on architecture. And I think it's, as I'm trying to say, it's a very I think it's a very relevant field of research to pursue, especially because it requires a lot of fundamental investigations. I think we are trying to sort of not go down to sort of the very core of that, but rather find a way of how you can actually implement the logics of natural constructs into still man-made architecture through the processes that I've presented, rather than sort of going all the way through kind of a fundamental setup of converging biological and technical production. I think it's more or less our research area, which that does not sort of should not preempt a kind of very interesting, stimulating discussion about this merger, which I am also absolutely convinced will take place, or is already taking place. I think there was a question by this gentleman here for a long time.
Okay, we will have one more question and then we can inform.
Here.
Yes, hello. It has been a very interesting lecture. I would like to ask you about living materials and inert materials. It means that I feel that you are working with wood, which is a part which was alive in the past, or a part of a living system, but now is dead and it's moving again. What I wanted to say, if it's necessary, a part of a living organism in order to move again, or if you could take cellulose and process it in a artificial way and obtain some elements that moves in the same way or even better.
I mean, just one interesting aspect is that there are all kinds of plant movements when the plant is still alive. They are usually triggered by changes in cell pressure, turgor pressure. The spruce cone, and that's why we actually investigated this one, is when it actually moves, is already dead. It's actually dead, what is in biology called a dead organ of the plant. It's going to detach from the tree. There's no metabolic function that supports this movement. It's a dead organ that lies dumb on the ground and it still moves. And also the spruce cone actually moves thousands of times. So the intelligence is embedded in the kind of process of growth, which obviously really refers to the metabolic function, the living aspect of the plant. But it actually, its biological function, the seed release, is fulfilled when the organ is already dead. That's interesting. And we choose that because it is a metabolically independent movement. It means that it's actually energy independent. Whereas all these other plant movements, mimosa, sort of move their leaves and all this, is obviously driven by metabolic processes, which are energy intensive. That's one reason. The second part of your question is that we have actually currently a research project where we applied for, where we're trying to replace the wood material with a kind of synthetic polymer material, which will behave in a similar manner. Mainly because somehow people don't trust wood. No? I mean, even a 2-year kind of long-term test don't convince people that it will not eventually fade, and if you build a facade with that, it's supposed to last 15 years or 20 years, and they just simply trust the kind of synthetic polymer more than a piece of wood. So, and obviously, if you change to synthetic polymers, you can tune the behavior even more than what you can actually do with wood. But it's actually a considerable challenge, because we're working with applied polymer physicists from the University of Freiburg, and they say that, or we have figured out with them, that it's extremely difficult to engineer something that is as intelligent as wood is, because wood does not only change shape, it also changes its stiffness. So the polymer composite engineers, they can actually engineer something that changes shape. They can also engineer something that changes stiffness with relative humidity, but something that does both is incredibly tricky for them, because they work with the kind of nanostructuring of the polymers, and that doesn't take into consideration this kind of microfibrillar lubrication that you get in wood. It's interesting.
I have a technical question here. Regarding the 2010 pavilion, like you're talking about using the bending properties of wood to, like, it creates internal stresses in the wood itself, and that gives you the entire structural stability. But then when you talk about wood that's wet or like completely exposed to rain, it behaves absolutely differently, and it loses all the stresses that were already inside it. So does it talk about, like, does a structural system that you present here talk about pertaining to those loss of stresses and still creating a stable structure, or does it talk about absolute temporality of the structure only relevant to a dry state of the material?
That's obviously a very good question, because wood is a viscoelastic material, no? So which means it creeps. If you take a piece of wood, you bend it, you hold it for 2 hours, you can actually bend it a little bit further. That's because the microfibrils arrange in the process of bending. And that was actually the third part that we wanted to investigate with this structure, because if you bend it, and this elastically bent piece has what is called residual stress, that residual stress contributes to the stiffness of the overall system. If that residual stress vanishes over longer periods of time, that means that the kind of structural capacity vanishes with it, which means that the system is not stable any longer. And it's very interesting that in the Frauto, the big, and this building by Frauto spans 80 meters. Nobody has a clue how much residual stress is still in the system. Because nobody knows, if you would take one of these strips out, would it actually remain to be formed like that, or would it still go back to the straight state? Because there's not enough scientific work on that. So what we actually did is we actually monitored the humidity cycles that this thing was exposed to, and at the end of the life of this pavilion, we dismantled it completely, and we exactly measured the kind of creep in the system, sort of how much the wood had begun to shape itself because of the creep. And it was interesting to see that it had hardly actually took, despite the fact that it was up for a long time and there were actually considerable humidity cycles, it actually went to become almost entirely straight again.
One of my experiments with veneer sheets was that, like, a normal veneer sheet, you can easily bend it. But the moment you wet it with water, it would turn into paper. So it no longer has exactly the same properties as a dry sheet. So I was wondering, like, if that kind of phenomena would be seen here as well.
No, I think it's the same phenomenon. If you wet wood, what is really happening is it becomes hygroscopic. It adsorbs water. That's what you do if you steam bend wood. And that means what happens is that the microfibrils are lubricated and they can shift along each other, which means that you can bend it easier. But actually steamed wood goes back to almost the same mechanical properties as before. I mean, it loses actually quite a bit, but that's depending on how long you steam it, etc., etc. So that's the natural occurrence. But that's the same for all natural composites. I mean, if you remember the There was one engineering diagram of the scale of the skin of the lobster, the exoskeleton, and you could see there was actually a graph for the dry exoskeleton and a graph for the wet exoskeleton. Same phenomenon, no? The mechanical behavior changes dramatically depending on what is called the fiber saturation point and the moisture content.
Thank you.